when Joe approached me about having this conversation at the Franklin County Community Partnership meeting, I thought this is the perfect place to have this discussion, because the child care challenges that we're facing in our region and across the state doesn't just impact parents, caregivers, families. It impacts all of us. It touches all different industries, all different fields. And so this really is a group issue. When we talk about adverse childhood experiences, kids in DCF care, kids facing, living in families who are exposed to opioids, we know that kids who are in caring environments, building healthy relationships, that's what's really going to impact their futures and kind of that return on investment when we talk about health care and mental health and just all of the skills and all the great things that kids really need. They can get that in childcare, and when there aren't enough childcare slots for kids, people are forced to leave the field. Kids are maybe in environments that aren't so positive, potentially toxic, and that's where they're spending their time because they don't have access. So it really is an issue for all of us, including business, industry, just everyone. So we have a lot of information, a lot of stats, and I have a jazzy video in there because I think videos can sometimes articulate better than a really tired mom of a 2-year-old. So who went trick-or-treating last night with her for the first time. So I just want to put out there that for me, as a parent-child center program director, obviously professionally, this is a really important issue. But it's also an issue that affects me very personally because I am the mother of a 2-year-old who is in childcare, and I've seen huge leaps and bounds of growth for her at her center. So I feel really lucky that we found a place, and I drive 30 minutes to get there in the opposite direction because there aren't a lot of slots available for infants and toddlers specifically. So I can digress. I can talk a lot about this. I don't want to keep people here for the next 12 hours, so I'm going to actually turn it over to Michelle and Crystal. And we've already done introductions, but again, just really briefly, Michelle, if you want to, we'll do a little introduction again.
So I'm Michelle Treya from Northwestern Counseling and Support Services. I'm the Child and Adult Care Food Program. We sponsor the Child and Adult Care Food Program for registered child care providers in Franklin and Grand Isle counties.
And I'm the Director of Child Care Licensing, so we're responsible for licensing and regulating child care programs around the state of Vermont to include home-based, center-based, and after-school care.
Great. Joe. All right.
So you can see that since July of 2009 to July of 2017, we've seen a reduction in registered homes around Vermont. And for Vermont, that's pretty significant because we have a lot of communities in which homes are the child care option. There may not be buildings for centers or locations where that can occur, so that's pretty important. And you can see that that means that we've lost about 447 child care slots.
And since May of last year, we at NTSS have been keeping track of why have these programs closed in our region, just so we could have some sort of idea when we're talking to community partners about why they've closed. As you can see, almost a quarter of them actually, people have either moved out of state or out of the county. Primarily, most of them have moved out of state, so we've actually lost them to the workforce as well. And then we've had another 22% that have left for positions that offer benefits. Because primarily Franklin and Grand Isle is made up of registered home providers, so they're self-employed people. So unless they buy their own benefits or have a spouse that has benefits at their work, then that's why they're leaving. We've also lost another percentage to health and family reasons. About 8% have left because of the regulations that people have been hearing a lot about in the news. And then the list goes on as to why the other people have been leaving at smaller amounts. We've lost 6% to retirement. What we do like to make people aware of is in the next 1 to 3 years, that number is going to go up drastically because in Franklin Grand Isle, we actually have a child care workforce that has been in the field for a very long time. We have a lot of people that have been in the field for over 30 years.
So I wanted to put out the need for childcare in our region. Let's Grow Kids put out a report called Stalled from the Start, and they did a ton of research and a ton of work, so thanks to Let's Grow Kids. And so 785 infants and 425 infants are likely to need care in Franklin and Grand Isle. 98% of infants that are likely to need care don't have access to high quality programs. So there's a little star by the high quality. High quality is identified by the number of stars a provider has. It's a little bit of a controversial thing because some people argue that stars doesn't necessarily mean quality, but when we talk about it in terms of this report, we talk about it in the number of stars. So high quality is identified as 4 or 5 stars. So we talk about 82 infants and 44 toddlers likely to need care in Grand Isle. 81% of infants and toddlers likely to need care don't have access to high quality programs. And more than 69% of Franklin County kids under the age of 6 are likely to need some form of care. So we're kind of moving into this, the landscape is really shifting, and it has been for a while where, we might have had in the past one family member who could stay home with a child and provide that care for them. And now we're really seeing that both family members need to be in the workforce to really be able to afford their lives. And so if both families are in the workforce, then we need a healthy place for a child to learn and grow and develop. And so we're seeing that we have 69% of kids under the age of 6 need some form of childcare because their parents are both in the labor force. And so these are pretty staggering percentages when you think about 98% of infants and 81% of infants in Franklin and Grand Isle are not able to find placement in high quality programs. And that's centers and home child care registered home providers, and we're very rural. A majority of our child care slots are registered home providers. Thanks. So I wanted to put after school in here. I think often after school gets forgotten. A child moves into kindergarten, we're like, all right, we're all set, we're good. Most parents don't work till 2:30. Their day continues on. And so we know that children need somewhere healthy and safe to be. And so 24%, so it's over 21,000 kids K through 12 responsible for taking care of themselves after school. And so we know that we have a huge amount of kids who are accessing after-school programs in the state of Vermont. 33% of Vermont's K through 12 children would participate in after-school program if one was available. So I used to be an after-school director. It was many moons ago, so I can't really speak to what's going on with the grant funding, but I know that a lot of places have lost their funding and a lot of after-school programs have closed their doors. So that's really a big gap in where do kids go from 2:30 to 5:30. So that's where a lot of kids can get mixed up into things and make some tough or bad choices. 79% of adults surveyed in Vermont agree that after-school programs help working parents keep their jobs. So again, when we think about the business sector, we're losing parents in the field because they're having to switch jobs, take part-time jobs, leave the field completely. That's not just parents of the children, it's also grandparents. So we're seeing kind of the older adult population having to leave the field prior to retirement because they're staying home and taking care of grandchildren. So again, I already said more than 21,000 Vermont kids are enrolled in after school. Vermont does not currently have a dedicated state funding stream to build and sustain after school and expanded learning programs. I think it's really important that we look at it's both and. We have a child care challenge and we also have an after school challenge, and they're both really important and vital to the health and well-being of children and families in our region. Okay, so.
All right. So when we were looking at this and talking about this, we were trying to figure out what we regionally could do. And so I went to Amy one day in supervision and said, Amy, we have a committee on everything in this community, but we don't have one dedicated to childcare. And so we decided that we would get state and regional partners together to start what's called the Child Care Action Team. So we have a leadership team that's built from NCSS, Deb Grennan from the Franklin Grand Isle Bookmobile, Vermont Birth to 5 is on it, as well as one of our child care providers who's a Starting Points Network leader. And so we meet monthly. We have a mission and vision statement that we created as to what we were doing with the group. And we've been able to include many state and regional partners. As I said, Crystal sits on it, as well as Carl represents the legislature on it, so he's becoming well-versed in child care. So we appreciate that. And Elaine from the Messenger is doing a great job keeping child care in the Messenger so that people know what's going on.
So I think what's really exciting about the Child Care Action Team is we're really bringing together a group of diverse partners. I'm really excited at the work that so many folks at the table are doing. Michelle just mentioned Elaine. Elaine has written so much and really put out into the public about the crisis and what's going on in childcare. And so she comes to that meeting not just as, you know, somebody who's writing an article for the Messenger, but somebody who is really invested in this movement. You know, some of the neat things that we've been able to do, and we're a pretty young group. We've only just formed, and part of the reason that we wanted to make sure that everybody in this room knew about it was because, hey, guess what? You can join. Anyone can be a part of it. And if you don't think that you fit with the group, you definitely do, because, again, this affects all of us in the region and in the state. So some of the committees we're talking about recruitment and retention. We kind of looked at all the different groups who are working on early care and education in the state, and we made sure that we weren't duplicating anybody's missions or visions. So we said we really need to get more providers in the field, and we really need to retain the ones that we have. So, you know, we kind of circled around and we're like, we need to figure this out right away. And obviously, if there was a magical solution, we would have already done it. But there was a lot of kind of misconceptions about why providers are leaving or why they're feeling frustrated. And so we said, what if we did a needs assessment? What if we just put it out to all of the providers in the region and said, hey, what's going on? What would make you feel supported? Why do you enjoy the work that you do? You know, we want to hear your voice. So we're making sure that that provider voice is really represented. And so we got some really neat information back from those folks. Okay, good. It's the next slide. I thought I'd mess that up. I can't remember.
So we basically sent it out, as Amy said, to the listserv, and we got 58 providers respond. We asked them a series of questions based on appreciative inquiry just to get the feedback we wanted. And so this is some of the information we got around what supports they felt needed. One of the biggest ones was around financial classes, because these people, as they're running their child cares, are not only taking care of children, they're running a business, so they need to know all those pieces. And then there's around curriculum development. But then a big one really was around supporting families. As we identified when we were going around the room earlier, that there's families that we see through our organizations, that there are gaps in the system that need to be kind of filled in for them. These child care providers are seeing that as well, and they're seeing the families every day, supporting them on that basis. So what concrete supports are available to them? What parent education classes are available to families? Where are there funding to help meet some of those gaps around transportation and food and et cetera? The other thing that they really identified is trainings related to trauma and working with high needs populations. You know, as Alex could probably speak to, we definitely have a lot of children right now in child care that are in the family services division. And so how do we build enough supports for the people that are taking care of these kids during the day and getting the kids what they need? Around just basic materials, things that we hear from centers around finding high quality staff, and actually staff that meets licensing regulations, and just maintaining a high quality care that is affordable without having to charge families more, because they know families can't pay more. So that's kind of some of the information we gathered. The other thing that we gathered, because we always like to put a bright spot in it, is the last question we asked people is why? Why are you doing this? Why are you working so hard? Why? And so we gathered their answers and we put together a Wordle around why they're doing this. So this is what we came up with, just so you can see.
Can you keep it on the slide for a second?
Sure.
So one of the reasons that we wanted to make sure that we put up what the providers feel like they need is that we're presenting this to a really diverse group of folks who work for lots of different organizations who might have some ideas. Or again, Joe talked about how do we work in collaboration, how do we partner, what are some grants that we could work on together. So when we talk about this being everyone's issue, when we look at some of these needs from the providers, are there ways that you, your organization, or folks who you're connected to, or personally, can be part of the solution around supporting providers around some of this stuff? We know that the state has a lot of great programs and ideas that they're working on too, but that doesn't mean that we can't add to that great pool of supports and funds and ways to really help providers. So just something to think about. So I'm going to let you talk about the first one.
So some of you may know that in Franklin and Grand Isle County, we're fortunate enough to have what are called promise communities, and we have 3 of them. It was money that was allocated to the state for one of the projects under the Early Learning Challenge grant. And so the first Promise Community that was started was actually written by Michelle Spence. And it is for the towns of Swanton, Sheldon, and St. Albans City. And basically, out of that Promise Community, there were 7 strategies that were decided upon. We could apply for up to $200,000. What was amazing about that Promise Community is that the 7 strategies unfortunately cost $435,000. And we were able to find the rest of the resources to do that, to come up with the 7 strategies. One of the 7 strategies is actually around supporting child care providers, because we knew that there was a huge need. We are seeing the numbers decrease. And one thing that happened is the regulations. With the new regulations, there are new things that providers have to put in place, but unfortunately, there wasn't any money for them to put them in place, but they had to maintain their business. So we put together a grant that they could apply for to meet the new regulations. Each provider could apply for $1,000 to do what they needed to do. So those grants have gone out. So far we've approved 17 grants for about $16,000. So we have others that should be coming in. We also built in money to help new providers coming into the field in those 3 towns to also apply to meet the regulations.
Great. So I was a big part of the Alberg Promise Community. Getting some funding helped to support that community in writing the proposal. And I might just put you on the spot, Paul, because I know you know more about this. But in Alberg, I think that I know that they got $150,000, and the idea is to put all of that funding towards early care and education in a model where there'll be a child care center that then has supports and services embedded within it. Do you want to say more about that, or is that?
I mean, I think that's pretty good. We're still working on our plan.
Yeah, so the Alberg and Richford, sorry, I know it's Alberg. Alberg and Richford are still in the process of coming up with strategies, and they haven't gotten the money yet, but Alberg has really landed on that child care center with embedded supports. And then Richford, Mary Pickner wrote that proposal. Do you remember? No? You did it. Okay, well, so they're doing a lot of different things with their money, but one of the ideas that they had was around the mini grants as well. So supporting providers in meeting the regulations as well as education and training. So one of the things that many slides back, if you memorize them, because that's the expectation, there's a test afterward. was that 4% of providers have left because of compassion fatigue or burnout. And so we're seeing a lot of kids with high-level needs coming in who've experienced a lot of trauma in their homes, high ACE scores, who can be really challenging to work with. And so the idea for Richford is that if we can embed some additional education and training programs for those providers, that they'll be able to stay in the field. And just a side note that I actually have a meeting in Richford at 11, so when you see me rushing out of here at the end of this presentation, it's not because I don't want to be here with you folks, but we're trying to figure that last piece out for the education and training. So those are some of the things that we're doing in the community. Again, anybody in this room can be a part of these processes, specifically for Alberg and Richford as they're still moving along in the process.
So in terms of the work that the Child Development has done, one of the things was revising the regulations, and that was needed for a multiple of different reasons. One had to do with the fact that they hadn't been revised, and some sets hadn't been revised in almost 20 years, so a lot of things were outdated. There was also new federal requirements that Vermont had to comply with and make sure were in the regulations. One of our division's particular goals was to ensure that the regulations were clearer, and so that people understood what was expected. And we're definitely seeing the positive benefits from that. New applicants coming into the profession have an easier time getting through the application process or having more successful pre-registration assessment visits and have fewer questions about what's expected. So we've definitely seen some progress with that. One of the things that we just recently implemented this year for the first time in Vermont is developing guidance manuals that go along with the regulations. And those guidance manuals are filled with an abundance of resources and tools to help providers comply with regulations, whether it's referring them to different community partners like Vermont Department of Health and different resources and information they have, or resources within our division, or educational resources. It's all in one document that's formatted exactly like the regulations, so it's easy for them to hold them side by side. And it's not intended to be used as a book that you read from cover to cover. It's intended to be used like an encyclopedia, where you want to know something about a particular regulation, you look up that regulation and you see what's in there for information. The other thing that we've been offering a lot of support and services around is with helping programs come into compliance with the regulations. We've done a soft implementation process. We've just completed our first year of having the new rules be in effect. We started that year off with not really doing compliance visits so that people could really kind of relax and focus on what they needed to make for changes. Each program's first compliance visit after the new rules went into effect is more of a technical assistance visit. We are citing non-compliance for things that were pre-existing that hadn't changed that you're still expected to be in compliance with. But those things that are new, we're giving them technical assistance around how they're doing with coming into compliance. If they need some ideas or resources or supports, we're pointing them in those directions. There's also grants funding that's available through the division as well. And then we are collaborating with a lot of different other departments and divisions and agencies and community partners to support providers. I think one of the biggest ones we're working on right now is helping providers as a profession increase their qualifications. And so there is a lot of work happening with Vermont Adult Learning for those child care providers who don't have high school diplomas or GEDs to be able to obtain that. We're issuing variances so that if they need more time to come into compliance with that, they certainly have it. There's also work through CCV for people to take college courses, and both Vermont Adult Learning and CCV have opportunities for providers to translate prior education or work experience into obtaining their professional goals. So we're trying to use existing services and resources versus creating our own to help support them in that process.
Joe, I don't know if we have enough time for a 3-minute video.
No, we can.
Okay. So it might take me a second. I might need some support from someone.
well, getting the video set up, just to put in perspective, we've talked about, food shortage, country support. The last Hunter Council meeting, when they had a survey, basically a family of 4, just to meet basic living expenses, requires an after-tax income in the range of $53,000. That means a family of 4, after taxes, you gotta be bringing home $1,000 a week. And that's why when you talk about families that have to have 2 wage earners.
Right. So one of the pieces that I touched on earlier was we talk a lot about that birth to 3 and the brain, how it builds and develops, and that every second, I'm probably going to get this wrong, I'm not a scientist, I'm not going to pretend to be, but there's a million new brain connections that are formed, and if we're not using them, they're pruned, and so that's kind of a big deal. And we know that that kind of foundation is built really early on, and then kids take that into, into kindergarten, into the pre-K, kindergarten, into adolescence, and into adulthood. We also talk a lot about how adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress can really impact that health, mental health, and physical health long-standing into adulthood. And so we know that when children are in positive early education programs or have those experiences, that really can help to mitigate the risk and the effects, so that building the resiliency, people talk about kids are resilient just naturally, they're not. Kids build resiliency in a lot of different ways, but a big piece of that is having a caring, positive, caring environment and person to support them. So if you're coming from a situation where you're not really getting that at home, having a child care or early education experience that is providing that for you can really do so much to impact children's long-term futures. So we just wanted to, because I can't articulate it as, I get really passionate and I just fumble my words. So I thought this video would do a better job at saying what I want to say around how do we mitigate the risk and effects of ACEs by really building those strong early education, early care and education establishments.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, and An important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
Okay. So that really speaks to those healthy relationships, really helping kids to have the skills to become healthy, well adolescents and adults. And that our early care providers and that network of folks who do that work really are helping children to build those skills. Again, mitigating the risks of toxic stress. And also that early intervention piece. They're really the ones who are with the kids for long stretches of time. They know the families and they really can say, here are some risk factors, and really step in earlier before, kids are multiple years old and they've been living in, stressful environments for years before we get to them. So I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint really quick. Last slide, we did it. And now I don't know how to make it bigger. Okay. So all of society benefits from investments in early childhood programs, and then I have that's like the no-no for PowerPoints. It's like a giant chunk of words, but I'm just going to read it because that's my deal. High-quality early care and after-school programs improve kindergarten readiness, enhance social emotional development, build protective factors in families, mitigate the risk associated with ACEs by building resilience, and boost the local economy by allowing family members to remain in the workforce, including grandparents who often leave the workforce to take care of their grandchildren. So it really is something that impacts all of us, in that these early care and education opportunities for kids just do so much for them, and that's why it's such an important issue, and we want to shout it from the mountaintops. So any questions, comments, thoughts?
Can you share that short video? That's a really great, quick way to explain that.
Yeah, it's great. I found it on the Let's Grow Kids web. Woo! Let's Grow Kids on their website. So yeah, definitely.
Can I add a couple things around some of the things that the child development has seen communities do to support child care needs is employer-supported child care programs. So employers like hospitals or factories have opened a child care program at their location for their staff. That's been successful around the state in many areas. We've seen some creative solutions. There's a small school in Vermont that has about 10 preschoolers a year, but not the ability to transport them and the child care to support their needs. So they invited somebody in the community to come in and license an after-school or after-care program in the preschool classroom when preschool's done for the day. Those children don't have to move or go anywhere. The two teachers have contact with each other, and it meets the needs in the community. One of the amazing things, and Sarah's a licensing field specialist with our division, we had one applicant, registered home applicant, who really didn't have enough materials for us to approve a license. And so she was able to connect to the larger child care community, and within 1 week everybody gave her one item. And she had what she needed for us to issue her license and be able to have sufficient materials to at least start her program. And there's also a lot happening with Vermont Birth to 5 with shared services, where providers can get discounts, get already drafted handbooks and contracts and trainings and different materials as well. So when I think about the kinds of ways that we can all maybe jump in, there's lots of different unique ways that really are unique to different communities around the state. Everyone approaches it differently based on what their needs are. So I wanted to throw some of those out there for you guys.
I think it's a creative approach to solving the challenge, and it needs to be everybody's lift. Thanks.
Any other questions? Certainly with some of the statistics that we saw there, outside of the box thinking, I know we talk about that term a lot of times, outside of the box thinking, but certainly it's going to be needed. And I think some of the examples Crystal gave, I think for our area, because our area is a little different from some other areas in Vermont, and what are going to be the ways that we might be able to think outside the box and yet meet the needs? Because there were a couple other scary things there. Of course, number one is the number of children that cannot receive quality services right now. Number two, though, was that other part, which was all of the individuals that have been involved for years that are retiring. So what's coming behind those individuals who are going to not only A, fill that number, and two, maybe grow that number so we can start drilling down on all of these young children that don't have the ability to get quality care now. So I think, again, this outside the box thinking of how can we do it in Franklin, Grand Isle counties maybe a little differently. The time has come.
And to support, one of the things that Michelle and I, over the last few years, have experienced is several applicants that couldn't find locations where zoning would allow them to operate. So just around being aware, and when people are advocating for changes to zoning so that child care programs could open in particular places like basements of churches, that can happen, and removing some of those barriers that are existing in our county.
Since September 1st has come and gone now, and these new regulations are in effect, and your compliance visits are beginning to happen, or your, how should I say it, pre-compliance visits are happening, what is the biggest issue that some of the child care providers are talking about?
Sarah, do you want to speak to that?
I feel that most of the people, once we go out on a self-compliance visit and talk about them, I think the change was really challenging, but then once we talk about it, they realize it's doable and was okay. One of the biggest things I think maybe for registered homes is the cushioning materials. But I know you're talking about the cushioning material for underneath the slide or a swing set, because that's a big purchase for some of the registered homes, and I believe that's what some of the grants that Michelle was talking about.
Quite a few of the grants that we have supplied to the Promise community have provided cushioning for people or people that needed fences to meet the new regulations. We've built some fences too.
One of the things that's important to remember is that some of these things like fences and cushioning materials were not required items. So if the home wasn't pre-existing identified as having hazards that would require a fence, the new regulations didn't require a fence. And if there were hazards, then we already required a fence. So what the regulations did speak to is if you have a fence, what does it need to look like? And you don't need to bring it up to the standard unless it's falling apart and it needs to be repaired. Then it would need to meet that. And with cushioning material, we know that there's lots of outside opportunities for children. It doesn't have to require the use of a swing or a slide. So providers aren't at a deficit if they weren't able to get the cushioning material. We would brainstorm with them other outside activities that they could do with children in place of. And they don't have to take down those climbing structures, because we know someday they might be able to install that cushioning material. So a lot of it was education around what the rules actually required and some of the strategies around making plans for that. One of the other things that I think of is qualifications. That has been a little bit of a lift for registered homes who do not have a high school diploma. That has been a point of stress for them. We've received several variances for those individuals to have additional time. They can have as much time as they need. We are supporting those variances and ensuring that they have an appropriate action plan. And in centers, not all positions had a lift in terms of qualifications, but the one position that did was a teacher associate. So that it does require some level of college. So they might need to be taking college courses, and I think our biggest messaging has been not to push it, not too much too fast, because you're working full-time, you have your own family, and then taking 1 or 2 college courses a semester might be too much. So really having them think about how to stretch that out, and if they need beyond the 2 years that was given to them in the regulations, they can just request a variance and we'll approve that and support them to have additional time. So I think that's one of the areas where we've seen concern and been able to strategize with people around what would work best for them. One of the other challenges is there's not a lot of qualified staff to work in childcare. So that has been challenging. So what we have also done is allowed variances for people who might have the skill set, not the education, but they have the willingness to complete the education. And so those childcare programs are submitting variances saying, would you let me hire this person into this position, and will you give them time? So we're essentially trying to support training the field up so that we have a robust field with people that do meet qualifications. So those are other ways that we're supporting what's happening right now so that there is enough staff for programs.